The last lesson introduced us to the contention that prevailed between the Orientalists on the one hand, who promoted the spread of Oriental studies, traditional studies among the Indian masses. And on the other hand, there were the Anglicists who promoted Western education with using English as a medium of instruction in the subcontinent. We learnt about several Anglicists and how they were vehemently against the Oriental vision of learning. Now, at this point of time, the Britishers were too filled with an idea of the superiority of their language, their culture, their literature, their education system. And so, invariably, Western education was introduced in the Indian subcontinent. In this lesson, we will trace the impact that this introduction of Western education had on the masses of the subcontinent. But in order to understand what the impact of the Western education was in the Indian subcontinent, we will have to go back to a time when this Western education was not introduced in the Indian subcontinent, when various vernacular language schools were there where the Indian masses used to go in order to gain knowledge. So let us now briefly talk about the schools that were there in the subcontinent prior to the introduction of this Western education. Now, in the 1830s, a Scottish missionary by the name of William Adam was appointed by the East India Company, and it was William Adam's task to go around in the schools in the districts of Bengal and Bihar and to see how primary education in vernacular languages was being imparted at these schools. And when he began his survey at the districts of Bengal and Bihar, he found that there were around 1 lakh pathshalas. Now, these pathshalas were small centers of learning in these districts in Bihar and Bengal. And in these pathshalas, small number of students used to study. Around 20 students used to study in these pathshalas. Now, you might be questioning who established these pathshalas. Well, these pathshalas were mostly set up by wealthy people, local communities, or even teachers who were called gurus. And you will be surprised to know that in these 1 lakh pathshalas, over 20 lakh students were taught. So the number was considerably huge. So many students were attaining education in these 1 lakh pathshalas in Bengal and Bihar, as William Adam had reported. Now, when we talk about these pathshalas, as we get to know about them from William Adam's report, we will be surprised to know that education system during this time was very different from what we know today. So let us now briefly learn how education or knowledge was imparted to the students in these pathshalas. These pathshalas did not have standard fees. Then textbooks were also not taught at the pathshalas. There weren't any schools for these pathshalas, no chairs or benches either, even no blackboards. In fact, there were no attendance registers. Students did not have to take exams, and there were no timetables or routines. These pathshalas mostly happened under the shade of banyan tree or near the huts of the gurus. Now, these gurus used to teach whatever they wanted, and education was oral, it was spoken. These students did not have particular classrooms. Instead, they used to queue up before the gurus. So what we learnt about is how these pathshalas used to function in earlier times in the Indian subcontinent. Now, this kind of a pathshala was very different from the education system that we see, witness and experience today. Now, these pathshalas also had very different modes of functioning. In our schools and colleges, we get vacations for particular festivals. Likewise, these pathshalas used to remain closed during harvest time, and classes resumed after the crops were cut and stored. Now, why do you think this kind of a thing used to happen in these pathshalas? Well, this flexible system ensured that every children got their opportunity to study, because in these pathshalas there were no particular timetables or routines, and these gurus used to teach these students individually. And education was also not restricted to the textbooks. It was imparted orally or through words. And then these pathshalas also used to remain closed during the harvest time, because many children from the peasant families were not able to join the pathshalas during the harvest time. At that time they had to work at the fields, which is why the pathshalas remained closed. So this was a very flexible system, as William Adam had found out, and this school system suited to the local needs, to the needs of the people who attended these schools. So all children got the equal opportunity to attend these pathshalas. But in our last lesson we learned that English education, Western education, modernized education so to speak, was introduced in the Indian subcontinent. Now because of this reason, the education of the common children, of those people who belonged to the toiling families, was severely impacted, because the expansion of modern education could not take place at the lower level. Why is it so? Let me explain this to you. The Britishers thought that they would impart Western education to a small section of upper and middle class people who could afford the same. And then these people who were trained in Western education would further pass on this knowledge to other masses in the population. Now this theory came to be known as the downward filtration, because knowledge or Western education was supposed to filter down from the Britishers to these middle class people, from whom it would spread to the masses. But it was not very smooth and efficient as it seems here, because this spread of Western education could not happen at the lowest level. Why is it so? Because those masses who were not very educated, not very well versed in the English language, were not able to grasp this modern Western education, which is why this Western education did not percolate down to the lowest rung or the lowest category of the society. And so, by using English as the medium of instruction, the Indian masses were now alienated, because they were not being able to reap the harvest of the introduction of Western education from the subcontinent. Instead, they felt alienated from this entire Anglicized education system. Because of this introduction of Western education, of this Anglicized version of studies, now this thing created a class of Indians who were Indian in blood and color, but British in thought, morality and intellect. So these upper class or middle class people who could afford Western education were in blood and color Indians, but their minds were filled with the British ideas, with Western education. So in their thought, morality and intellect, they were entirely British. So this now created a rift not just in the society but within the individuals themselves, because these individuals were not just alienated from the rest of the masses, but these individuals felt a split within themselves, because by birth they were Indians, but this introduction of Western education had made them British in every possible way. Now in the year 1854, the Board of Control of the British East India Company now sent a dispatch to the then Governor General of the British East India Company, which was Lord Dalhousie. And the President of the Board of Control of this British East India Company was Charles Wood, which is why this dispatch came to be known as the Wood's Dispatch. Now this Wood's Dispatch marked the final triumph of those who opposed Oriental learning, because by this Wood's Dispatch now Charles Wood and this entire Board of Control of the British East India Company suggested a complete shift and transition to using English as the medium of instruction in the British East India Company. So all those Orientalists who had clamored for the spread of Oriental studies in the Indian subcontinent were almost defeated, so to speak. And it was the idea of the Anglicists, the idea that Western education should be spread among the Indian masses, now gained precedence. Before proceeding with this lesson, let me ask you a question. When was the Wood's Dispatch sent to Lord Dalhousie that marked a triumph for the Anglicists? Was it sent in 1852, 1857, 1890 or in 1854? Well, the correct answer is 1854. Issued by Charles Wood, this Wood's Dispatch was sent to Lord Dalhousie in the year 1854. So let us now look at the things, the points that this Wood's Dispatch of 1854 suggested. The Wood's Dispatch highlighted the economic advantage of the Western education in India. So firstly, he looked at this from an economic vantage point. That is to say, the introduction of Western education in India would now introduce the masses to the knowledge of trade and commerce. And when the Indian masses, to be specific, would gain knowledge on trade and commerce, they would be provided an impetus to develop the resources of the country. And if the Indian masses are given an impetus to develop the resources of the country, then the British East India Company would benefit from the same. So this point of the Wood's Dispatch was seen from an economic vantage point. Now the next point was seen from a cultural vantage point. Introducing Indians to the European ways of life would increase the demand of British goods in Indian markets. How is it so? This is because the Indians would now be introduced to the European ways of living. And so they will also be enticed by the commodities, by the products, by the various things that the Britishers use. And these things are produced in England. So if the demand for these English goods and commodities increase in the Indian markets, then the Britishers would be able to send more and more of their goods to fill the Indian markets. So both of these points of the Wood's Dispatch of 1854 had the economic consideration of the British East India Company at their foundation. At the same time, the Britishers were completely trying to dominate the culture of the Indian masses. Because by introducing Western education and Anglicized education in the subcontinent, the Britishers had already seen how it bred a new class of Indians who were only Indians in their blood and skin. Because those people were completely British with respect to their morality, with respect to their ethical values, with their culture. And so the Britishers were now trying to extort as much profit as they could from the introduction of Western education in the Indian subcontinent. The Wood's Dispatch also put forward the argument that Western education would inculcate moral values among the Indians. He believed that Eastern education was not sufficient enough to instill moral values, ethical values, commitment to work, passion to work among the Indians, which is why the Indians were indolent and unethical. But if Western education could now inculcate a sense of morality and ethical values among the Indians, then a whole host of trustworthy and reliable civil servants could be produced. And it was much easier and profitable for the British East India Company to make use of these civil servants who were produced in the subcontinent rather than bringing the civil servants from England. So in this way, by introducing Western education in the subcontinent and strengthening its influence on the Indian masses, Charles Wood as well as many other Anglicists thought that a whole lot of officials would be produced who could be relied upon. During this time, the government now started introducing many reforms with respect to the introduction of Western education in the subcontinent. The British Indian government now set up education departments to extend control over all education matters. So till this point of time, the British Indian government was mainly focusing on higher education, and so it wanted to take control over all matters that pertained to higher education. We know that when the revolt of 1857 broke out, Sepoys were mutinying. They were agitating at Meerut, Delhi and several other places. But in the same year, the British Indian government was setting up universities, and 3 universities were set up in Calcutta, Madras and Bombay in 1857. And these universities came to be known as the Mumbai University, the Calcutta University and the Madras University. Now these universities were set up in 1857 for the promotion of Anglicized Western education in the Indian subcontinent, and these universities are still functional even today. So the fact that these universities still teach so many students talk about how the Britishers had influenced the entire education system in India. So just a while ago we mentioned this point that till the latter half of the 19th century, the Britishers were mainly focusing on higher education. But now they wanted to go back to the roots of education, that is to say, take care of the primary education. And when they were not taking care of primary education, the local pathshalas were allowed to function whichever way they wanted. But when the Britishers started taking care of primary education, they now wanted to improve the local pathshalas. Now, how do you think this was done? They sought to introduce order in the system. They also imposed routines, established rules and ensured regular inspections. So all in all, the Britishers now started enforcing discipline in the local pathshalas, which used to function in autonomous ways earlier on. So let us now find out how the Britishers enforced discipline and rules and regulations in the local pathshalas. The Britishers appointed government pundits in order to supervise the local pathshalas, and these people took care of 3 to 4 schools. So they used to go and visit these schools frequently, and whenever they had to visit these schools, they ensured that these gurus were teaching properly, and after that these pundits had to produce reports on the same. Then timetable was introduced, textbooks were introduced, the students had to take exams, they also had to pay fees. They could now sit on chairs and benches. So this entire education system now underwent great changes. So when various changes like the enforcement of a strict discipline, rule and regulation, as well as the introduction of timetables, textbooks happened in the local pathshalas, the education system in the local pathshalas underwent drastic changes. Now many pathshalas had adapted to these changes very easily, which is why they were provided grants from the government. But at the same time, there were many pathshalas and gurus who were unwilling to work in the new system. And invariably these pathshalas and gurus who were unwilling to work in the new system received no government support. And over time they found it very difficult to compete with the government aided and regulated pathshalas. Now this introduction of a new education system in this primary level created another huge issue. This is because we learned that earlier on the local pathshalas were very flexible, and these pathshalas used to remain closed during the harvest season so as to allow those students who belonged from peasant families to work at their fields. Now, because of this introduction of a new schooling system, these schools now had proper routines, timetables, so the existent flexible system was no longer in place. And because of the enforcement of strict rules and disciplines under this new system, there were a whole lot of dropouts. That is to say, many people discontinued going to school because those children who belonged to the peasant families could not attend the schools regularly, and when they did not attend the schools regularly, it was seen as a lack of interest in those students. But in reality, those students were too poor to afford to go to the schools regularly. So in this lesson we learnt about the impact that the introduction of Western education had in the Indian subcontinent. Now we learnt that because of this introduction of this Anglicized education, there now came into being a new middle class of Indians who thought in British ways, who spoke in the language of the colonizer, who were only Indians only because of their blood and race. But in reality, the British culture, the British education system had completely begun to dominate these people. And we also learnt about how this education system affected children in the primary schools in the rural districts. So having learnt about the impacts of the colonial education in the Indian subcontinent, in our subsequent lesson, we will learn how the Indian masses were responding to this introduction of Western education in the Indian subcontinent. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and hit the bell icon. You can also register for free at DeltaStep.com or download the DeltaStep app to learn one-to-one with our amazing teachers or to get access to all our 5,000 plus amazing videos as per your school syllabus. Master each topic with our adaptive practice technology. Get million+ questions with step-by-step solutions and unlimited mock tests. Get all your doubts resolved instantly. Learn via games and win amazing prizes like PlayStations and iPads. So at DeltaStep, learning is not just fun and easy, it's rewarding too. So register for free now.